Welcome to The Plain Truth. I'm Plain, your host on this trip, and we like to cover mysteries, anomalies, and a little bit of conspiratorial stuff here. And today we're going to get into ancient mysteries and some other things from the past. Joining me will be Disaster Cat, Mash, and Neil. Thanks for coming along. Are you there, Disaster Cat?
Yep, I'm here.
Good. Mash?
Hi, I'm here.
Well, let's just get right into it. Today's topic is ancient mysteries, and then a little bit of some of the ways people have found things, like psychic archaeology, or just going with a hunch, so to speak. So I thought we'd start with something that is a little bit between mainstream and not mainstream, but maybe it's not discussed much, so I thought it'd be a little interesting topic, and that is the history of Japan. Where did the Japanese people come from, and the language? Have any of you ever read about that or heard any thoughts on that?
I know about the Jomon and that they were around for quite a few thousand years, and that until very recently, my understanding was the modern Japanese didn't really want to talk about them or whatever, but lately there's been a certain amount of revival in wanting to look at that. But you know a lot more about that than I do, probably.
That's probably true. Mash, Neil, any thoughts?
I know a little bit about early Japanese history, mostly the medieval period. And I remember reading something about there's this particular tribe up north, the albino tribe, or they're mostly albino.
Well, they're the Ainu.
Yeah.
And they're like the most hirsute people on Earth. So they have more than enough hair, and they might be either the Jomon people or related to the Jomon, because if you look at, let's say, the Japanese and compare them to, say, the Koreans or Chinese, they have dramatically more hair, as in facial hair or body hair.
Yeah, there's like one tribe up north that's like, doesn't seem to relate it to anybody else. They're just kind of like individuals on their own.
Well, they were an individualistic kind of group of people, so that's certainly an aspect of Japan, and it's interesting looking into them. And they might be, again, closer to the Jomon, who I would argue went to places like Ecuador or Peru or whatever a long time ago, and California, and British Columbia, wherever. That's certainly. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, when they did the DNA tests, I believe, on Kennewick Man, they found, just as I suspected, that if he was related to anybody, he seemed most closely related to the Ainu, which made perfect sense to me. Because I was saying all along that if they were going to rebury him, they ought to call the Ainu elders, probably. And then I didn't actually do that, but that was basically the conclusion, because it made sense. You had somebody 6'4" in their skeleton, enough to tell that they were very tall and kind of, I gather the Ainu look kind of Caucasian, but not exactly. When I was in anthropology in the 1970s, they called them Proto-Caucasians. They don't call them that anymore, because that kind of implies that, if you were a good person, you'd want to be Caucasian.
The way to becoming a Caucasian.
Yeah, exactly. But they are different, and there at least one person with that DNA was found in North America, as far as I recall. I'd have to look that up to verify it, but I'm pretty sure that was the case.
Yes, I think there's a good case for that the Kennewick Man is actually from either today's Japan or wherever some of those tribes or people came from. Neil, you got any thoughts on this?
I wish I did, but I'm not that familiar with the Japanese history, although the Kennewick Man I have read about, and it certainly is a unique story, and he was an individual that definitely was not around that part of the world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well now I'm going to throw a little curveball into the discussion. And the curveball, you may not have heard this topic before, but some people argue that the ancient Japan we know of, let's say what's today Kyoto and that area, was the terminus for the Silk Road. So it had a very Silk Road kind of feeling to it. And I think you see this when now and then the emperors palace or whatever has an exhibit at a museum or something. I've looked at these things, and it's overwhelmingly Silk Road feeling. It's not really Japanese feeling at all. And presumably that's because they get gifts, right? Kings exchange things and diplomatic stuff. But nonetheless, it is pretty striking. And going from that, then I'd say, okay, well, that's kind of interesting. So this was really part of the Silk Road. And this might surprise you, but here's where we get off into a weird tangent. There may be one of the lost tribes of Israel here. In Israel, they have an official position by the government, and that's essentially the guy in charge of lost tribes or lost Jews. And he came to Japan and spent a fair bit of time investigating, and his conclusion was that it's an open and shut case. Overwhelmingly, one of the lost tribes of Israel came to Japan. And this is my view, is that there's just Jewish stuff all over Japan, and it's politically incorrect to get into. I could give endless examples, but let's take, for example, the most famous festival in Japan, which is the Gion Festival that takes place in Kyoto, something like July 17th. Anyway, that's exactly the same date that the Zion Festival takes place in Israel. And in this Gion Festival, they're all carrying these things that look like arcs all over the place, shouting phrases that make no sense in Japanese and nobody knows the meaning of. And then if you look on all of these arcs, they have pictures, and they're all like deserts and camels, and I think a couple of them have pyramids. And you have to sit there and say, wait a minute, this thing's been going on 1,300 years, and you're carrying this thing around, these pictures of deserts, camels, and such. Well, that's stuff Japan doesn't have at all. And then if you start looking into it, you'll find out that their cultural tradition is you've got these scholars with their square, small caps on their head, and the answer to all wisdom is in the Torah. And that's an interesting thought because, have I heard that before? So, first, I'd ask, have any of you heard of this before? Were you aware of this issue?
I've heard of it somewhere, and I don't remember exactly where.
Uh-huh.
But I have heard about it before.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Neil?
Yes, the same here.
Okay.
And it's been a long time, and I couldn't tell you where either. But it definitely is an anomaly.
No, I've
then Disaster Cat.
I've heard of the group that they actually proved were genetically related and are being brought over that's in India, but I hadn't realized in Japan. My question would be, have they done any DNA testing? Because they did that in India, and I remember the Israeli government, I think, was kind of, I won't say they were embarrassed, but they were kind of chagrined because the people, they actually had the legend of coming there. They believed they were part of, the diaspora, and it turned out they were.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And this was in India, so.
Well, I don't think this is, this is such a super sensitive topic that I don't think we're going to see DNA results that we could trust. Okay, because then you get into the other issue with all of these ancient mysteries is we might have better technology today, but who's in charge of it, right? I mean, are they going to let us know? But throughout Japan, you find all kinds of old stuff that's Jewish. The question is some of this stuff 1,000 years old or is it 2,000? And there's a big difference because well, let me give an example. I knew a guy who was from Turkey, and he was a professor, a linguistics professor, and he moved to Japan. And he told me that ancient Japanese, the language, and ancient Turkish were very, very similar. All kinds of basic words, river, tree, whatever, were the same. But Turkey changed with the Arabic influence when the rise of the Arabic civilization came about. It really dramatically changed what Turkey was, or the Turkish language. And then similarly, of course, over the last 1,300 years or whatever period we're talking about, Japanese has changed dramatically. And indeed, I would argue that Japan is a country of massive immigration from all over, and so it's not really one culture at all. And racially, if you look at them, I mean, they have, white skin in one area, kind of darker skin in another, hair, everything is different. They're all from different places. It's just they've been fairly isolated for a certain period of time, and so they've intermarried. But that Turkic influence is obvious, and that makes sense because, again, we're talking about the Silk Road and these Turkic tribes along the Silk Road. But we get into the issue with the Jews is, are they Jews from Palestine or are they Jews from the Turkish sphere, like the Khazar kingdom? And I really don't have any answer to that, but I'm just going to point out that the Jewish stuff is indeed all over. And it's quite fascinating to see how something that's in your face like this, like I say, the most famous festival in Japan, I'm sure you've seen stuff on TV about it, has all this stuff in it that's from, again, camels and deserts, and I think a couple of them have pyramids. Now, what is that? It's amazing, isn't it? And in the documentaries I've seen on TV, they talk about some of the language, some of the words in Japanese are directly from Hebrew. Basic words, to live, stuff like that. Now, I'm not a linguist. I don't know Hebrew, but it's certainly possible that the Jewish tribe, or some of them, would have come to Japan, and they would have been particularly advanced in terms of being scholars or architects or things like that, and they would have had a disproportionate influence on the culture. So I'm not arguing that by blood the Japanese are 50% Jewish by any means. I'm just saying they might have been an influential minority who came here at that time during the Silk Road. And that's why you would see some of these things. I mean, if a society didn't have something like, pick some topic, but, the arcs that they carry around in their festivals, or the different rituals with salt and stuff like that. Look at when the West traveled all around the world and brought its technology and its systems. Almost the whole world wanted to copy it because the West was seen as being so advanced. So similarly, we could imagine that a bunch of educated scholars with a certain amount of science or technical skills in things like fiber working or woodworking or stuff like that would have been seen as impressive people, and they would have been respected, and so on and so forth. So that's a possibility. But now getting into the modern times, it's a bit conspiratorial, but a lot of people have rumored for a long time that the royal family in Japan basically considers itself from this line of Jews. And I really have no way of knowing, but there are certain signs that are politically interesting here and there. During World War II, the Japanese helped build some of the Jewish gangs in Shanghai and Manchuria that later went on to help establish Israel in things like blowing up the British Hotel and stuff like that. And you have to think, I don't know why they would have done that, but anyway, for conspiratorial talk, you got to realize the modern Japan was created out of the what's called the Meiji Restoration. And that was really the West coming in, especially London, the Rothschild people bringing in money and technology to build Japan, primarily to fight Russia, their traditional enemy. But there's definitely a feeling in Japan that the powers that be felt like they were betrayed in World War II, that they had all kinds of deals with the West, and that those deals were broken. And we'd never know what these deals were, but that's just another thought. So it also applies in modern terms, and then you can see that's another reason why they might hide this stuff. And then Disaster Cat, you got a background in anthropology. They have in Japan these mounds all over the place, huge mounds, and it's forbidden to look in them. It's very, very controlled.
Yeah, my roommate in Colorado, who I'm still in contact with, she comes to visit me over here in Ireland occasionally. She speaks Japanese major Oriental study had been several times to Japan, and I believe she mentioned those to me because we used to sit around and talk about archaeology a lot, and she would, mention that you could go into all the temples and stuff, but you couldn't. The mounds were just kind of there, and I think I remember seeing on, I think it was the special they did on Graham Hancock and Underworld, that some of the mounds, it looks like there may have been some off of the coast of Japan, something very similar, but I could be wrong. This would be different mounds.
Well, certainly there's the undersea stuff near Okinawa and Taiwan, like Yonaguni.
Yeah, it was stuff off of Yonaguni that they showed one mound above water, and they showed another mound that looked like it was underwater.
Makes sense. Now, I have heard from different sources, and I think it's true, that at the end of World War II, about a week or 10 days later, the U.S. sent in a fairly important group to do digging at one of these mounds, not too far from Osaka. Not in Osaka, but I mean, let's say 100 miles from Osaka. And that's kind of interesting because, of course, the war had just ended and America wasn't really ready for occupation yet. And they spent the money and time and resources to go dig at one of these mounds that really interested them. And I think that gets into that whole idea that certain members of the elite care about artifacts and things, and we can't even understand why. The war on Iraq, I mean, all kinds of very good things vanished. And you have to imagine that they had vanished for a reason, and some of it is not just the money. It has a meaning to certain people. But anyway, so this is just an intro to the idea that there can be, how can we phrase it? There are mysteries, but it's not polite to discuss them, I guess. How's that? So it's not denied. I mean, as I said, now and then they make documentaries about it or mention the fact that this Israeli representative says it's an open and shut case, but it's probably never going to be in the textbooks, at least in the West. So I think that's kind of interesting. But now we can move on a little bit, and I thought I'd ask, are there any mysteries that you find particularly interesting? MASH, any you're familiar with, you read about?
Oh, there's quite a few I read about in England when I was living over there. I mean, there's, of course, the case of Frederick Bly, or Frederick Bond. He was basically one of the head archaeologist at Glastonbury for a while, and he started coming up with all sorts of interesting finds in the 1920s and 30s, and he was doing a really good job. And somebody asked him, like, well, where are you getting this information? He's like, oh, I'm holding seances and talking to a dead monk. And they kind of went, no, that's not okay. But his information was correct. That's the interesting thing about it. I think he wrote a book called The Gates of Remembrance. Yeah,
I read that.
And there's another interesting case where was it an English lady, Miss Edith May Pretty, who lived near Sutton Hoo, and this is before the treasure at Sutton Hoo was discovered. She would be sitting there having tea at dinner. There's these mounds nearby, and she would occasionally see a Anglo-Saxon warrior walking around one of these mounds, almost like a ghost image and stuff like that. And she would have dreams about being a treasure being buried underneath this particular mound. And she actually asked one of her friends, who was an archaeologist, to start digging there. And at first they didn't find anything, but then eventually they did find the treasure ship that was the Sutton Hoo treasure. And it's interesting how these bits of information come out through psychic archaeology, but we still don't want to use it in the actual field of archaeology.
Well, Mash, you know that that's because psychic archaeology doesn't exist. They just now and then have a hunch.
Yeah.
They just won't admit it. It's unfortunate. And it's possible their best results come from it.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't think people should rely on it entirely. But what a good psychic can do is point, almost like a bird dog. They can point you in a direction and kind of narrow down the area. Especially the way we do archaeology nowadays, where you have to like lay out grids and you dig each little grid. If they can just kind of narrow down the field a little bit, I think it would help a lot.
For sure, for sure. Well, again, it's that they want to be seen as being super scientific, and so going on hunches is not what they're supposed to do, and they definitely don't want it to be based on something like a séance.
No.
But it's just unfortunate because they've had such really good results, I think. Speaking of psychic archaeology, there are a lot of other ones. There's the whole a couple of Egypt projects that Stephen Schwartz did. I think Alexandria off the coast there, trying to figure out how far into the coast, off into the water that went. And then there was one out in the desert, Morea or something like that. I don't know how to pronounce the town. But in the desert one, they brought Hella Hamid, if you've heard of her, and then George McMullen. Disaster Cat, you heard of McMullen?
Vaguely, yeah. I tried to read some of that transcript today. I didn't really had time, but I know that I read the Alexandria Project, so I'm a lot more familiar with that. But it's, I think it was the second one, I think, was a more controlled, intentional experiment. I got that impression.
Mm-hmm. Well, McMullen had been used, I think, by different Native American archaeologists. I think there was one somewhere fairly powerful who liked to use him, and I mean, unofficially, I assume, but he had very good results. And indeed, both Hella Hamid, by the way, was quite important in the development of remote viewing at Stanford. She was a photographer, and she was quite psychically gifted. Anyway, the two of them were used to find this abandoned city in the desert in Egypt that had been used in Roman times and then up to Byzantine times, but it was totally lost. And they both basically nailed it, what was going to be there, the depth, the location. And they'd done, I think, remote sensing, with instruments and found nothing before. Now, this was in the early days of some of this equipment, so maybe the equipment's a lot better today. But the fact remains that they discovered something that was in a place that it wasn't supposed to be, and they did a very good job of it. And so, as Mash was saying a minute ago, this can be really quite impressive because, I mean, you don't know where to go.
Right.
And all the archaeologists laughed at him. It's like, well, that's impossible. We know it can't be there because we did sensing tests.
Well, actually, you would find when I was studying archaeology, I mean, my major professor was actually not too quietly even because he had tenure, but he was both trained as a shaman, a real one, and even had some Siberian family. And he was also one of the leading field archaeologists of his generation. And he would come out and say things like, you need to tell, if you're writing a paper, you have to say it's a hunch. But he said, and so did many of the other people I talked to, almost everybody who is a good archaeologist knows that they have these just kind of gut feelings that they should look over there. And it's probably one of the reasons why so many spectacular finds tend to get found the last day or two of the excavation. Because the last day or two of the excavation, everybody's tired, everybody's getting a little slap happy. So they'll go off and do something on their, or maybe just like get cut loose a little bit from this, like that intensive grid system that you were talking about, that you have to like stay right between the lines and not go anywhere else and save the rest of it for future generations type stuff. But sometimes they'll go a little off the reservation on that last day or two, and that tends to be when things get found over and over again. And I think that's why, and people just won't say in the paper, I had a dream. But they do, or if they do, they'd say, well, I was thinking about it before I went to bed, and then obviously my subconscious came to these conclusions, and I must have really seen that there was something there. When in reality, and everybody around them knows. So actually, a lot of archaeologists are psychic and they do use it, but it's sad that they have to be so careful about talking about it, except with each other late at night with a bunch of wine at a party.
Well, that's where I want to go. I want to go to the archaeologists, drinking festival or whatever.
Yeah, you could watch my major professor say, I'm trying to drink beer. I don't really like it, but it's so culturally necessary here in Mississippi. Yeah.
Exactly.
Really exciting parties. Yeah, but you will hear things. And unfortunately, my late professor passed away a couple of years ago. Otherwise, if he was still in retirement, I would have tried to get him for this show, because I think once he retired, he would have probably been willing to say anything.
Mm-hmm.
He was just that kind of person.
Well, anyway, I think it's possible that a very large percentage of the interesting finds in archaeology in the history have been through these dreams or hunches or shamans or things like that. And I mean, when you think about it, you could dig anywhere on Earth. I mean, how did Schliemann find Troy? I mean, wasn't that kind of psychically driven?
Yeah, he was just like, yeah, here. I think he did have a dream about it.
He had a dream and he knew it was there. And when I was actually talking to my husband, who's actually been on digs when he was an undergraduate, he didn't ultimately go into archaeology, but he studied something very related. I was talking about Grant Hancock and the cities, the ruins off Yonaguni and possible cities off of India. And I was saying, Grant Hancock's not an archaeologist. And my husband went, the Schliemann effect. Because that's actually what it's called, is the Schliemann effect, when an amateur actually goes out and does something. And it works.
Yeah.
Well, it shouldn't be that surprising. Yeah, Mash?
I ran across an interesting story in Lynn Buchanan's book, The Seventh Sense. Mm-hmm. And it's about page 167. And for those of you who don't know, Lynn Buchanan, of course, is one of the military-trained remote viewers. And he had been approached one day by a historian he worked with the government, but he wasn't like, it's kind of an unofficial question the guy had asked. And the question he asked Lynn was, why? And he said, that's it. And he's like, yeah, that's the tasking. I want you to go figure this out. And so Lynn worked up a set of coordinates and did a session on it. And what he came across in his remote viewing session was a group of farmers that were going to a city, like an ancient city that wasn't like a permanent, it was an established city, but it didn't seem like people lived there permanently. It was more like a cultural center. And then a new group of farmers would come in. They would kind of like rotate in and out. They'd come in, do public service, and then leave. And after a while, people stopped coming to the city. And basically the cities got abandoned because there was like no one working in them anymore or doing anything like that. And he was trying to figure out why. And the answer he came up with was they had no money. And this didn't make any sense to Lynn Buchanan at all. He told the historian, and he was like, that doesn't make any sense to me either. And he kind of went off in a huff. Lynn Buchanan saw the same historian like a year later, and he was thinking, I'm in trouble because the same guy. And the guy was ecstatic. He said, I figured out what you meant by they had no money. His original question was, why were the Aztec and the Mayan cities abandoned? And basically the answer was they had no means of exchanging money. They didn't have a monetary system. So what the Aztec and Mayan governments did was people traded work service in the cities as a form of tax. Okay. And basically what happened was, because of crop failures or whatever, people stayed at home taking care of their business there as opposed to coming into the cities to work. And that's why they eventually just dwindled away and got abandoned. But I thought it was kind of an interesting story of like how you can use remote viewing not just to find something, a physical location, but also try to figure out an answer to something that's like, more complex answers you may not get from just archaeology.
Well, it's also something they probably wouldn't think about.
Right.
Now, I mean, I don't know if the answer is correct. I mean, we can't really be sure, but um, it's certainly worth thinking about that a bit if there's a way of trying to get an idea. I mean, for example, Disaster Cat, maybe you know, did they have money that we can think of? I mean, are there coins lying around from the Mayans or the Aztecs?
No, no. In fact, I do believe that the Aztecs were using cacao beans and a few other things as means of exchange, but I don't know that there's anything been found on the Maya. A lot of the information I had on the Maya is somewhat outdated because they've learned how to read the Maya script, and unfortunately, a lot of the first things they found, I mean, the first thing it did was they used to, when I was in school, they used to talk about the peaceful scientific Maya who watched the stars, and, you know, we're just all sweetness and light. And then, of course, it turns out most of the written language says things like, I, the great king, or in one case, my favorite, I, the great queen, so-and-so, have, you know, conquered my enemies, slain their warriors, taken their women's, and I'm now in charge, rah, rah. And so there went the peaceful Maya. But what is interesting about the money thing with the Maya in particular is seeing the farmers to me, because what I know of the excavations in Mayan cities is that you have these amazing complexes, and there's probably many, many that haven't been found yet. They had this incredible agricultural empire in the middle of what is now a jungle, and probably was then, probably doing things that we can't even quite imagine how they did it. But when you look at the actual city urban centers, there don't seem to be that many living spaces. There are some. You know, they found like essentially like tenant housing or whatever, but it's not nearly the number of people you would expect for what's going on in the size of the center. So having farmers come in and essentially do day labor, well, I mean, we don't know, but that's one theory of how the pyramids may have been built. I mean, there's a lot of controversy on that one, but the general theory, and it would make perfect sense to me that the Mayans may be doing that. The Aztecs, they're a little more complicated, but the Aztecs were kind of a real late comer to the game. They were actually a kind of overreaching, really new empire that were actually kind of so repressive that a lot of the Native Americans, when the Europeans first showed up, thought their gods had brought the Europeans over to help deliver them from the Aztecs and sided with them. And that was not the only reason the Aztecs ultimately lost, but it was one factor. Whereas the Maya had kind of already gone into decline, what they call decline. What the Mayans will tell you is we chose to leave the cities. You can ask them and they'll say, it got really violent and it became a very difficult way of life, and we left and we chose to become farmers again. Now, my husband, again, he's pointed out, well, that may actually be the official line, but did they really just kind of wipe each other out and they're the remnant population and this is a good story to tell the grandkids? Or did they really decide just to walk away from urban life? Nobody knows, but it is interesting.
Sounds like Detroit.
Yeah, very much so. And I mean, it's very possible that they were just kind of abandoned because for whatever reason, life got unlivable. I mean, there's theories about droughts and things as well, and all this may have contributed. But the other thing my elder friend has said about about the Aztecs is he said that there were rumors in the Southwest, even pre-European times, that very bad things were happening in the South, meaning Mexico and Yucatan, and that people should stay away from there. And the bad things were rumored to have been the Aztecs. Again, I don't know. That's just what he's told me. That's tradition.
Well, you know, we may never know for sure, but it certainly makes sense that these cities were not like cities that we think of today. They were more, gathering locations, and maybe priests lived there, but it wasn't like massive amounts of people lived there. They were still an agricultural society. And indeed, bad weather or other things could make it so people just simply wouldn't go. They would choose not to pay their taxes.
Well, the Aztec capital was incredibly urban. It was probably the largest
I was talking about the
Mayans.
Mayans.
Oh, the Maya. Okay, sorry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Aztecs, they came later, and they were really a different kettle of fish, I think. But But for sure, I mean, MASH, this is an example of something that uh, we can't be sure how accurate it is, but it's something that should be done a lot more. I mean, there should be lots of archaeologists trying to take advantage of these things, and there may be other things that that we're not aware of. Who knows? I mean, maybe there's a way of using lucid dreaming or something.
Yeah.
Just as an example.
Like I said, a lot of people just need to realize it's not good. It's like archaeology or remote view or anything. It's not going to give you the answer, but if you use it to point you in a direction and give you an extra clue, then you can think, okay, now let's go down this branch of research, stuff like that.
I have
Exactly.
to wonder about the remaining life force, if there is a life force, in these ruins that people are tapping into, from the past. I've had a personal experience in that area, which would be rather interesting if it's true. Looking at the different the symbols that are left for us to follow and try to interpret, about the people that were doing whatever they may have been doing, in the past. One time I was down in Arizona with an elder, and she was invited to go out towards Taliesin, which is a place where Frank Lloyd Wright trained architects, and they wanted her to have a look at some of the little medicine wheels that were on the property, and it's a huge piece of property. I forget how many hundreds of acres it is, but it's big. Anyways, I was there, and she said, "Come along." And I said, "Okay, great." So we went out, and we were walking up some of the nature paths that they have on the sanctuary there. And these the two people that were administrating the place at the time were pointing out these medicine wheels. And what caught my eye was something completely different up on a bank about 30, 40 feet away. Why it caught my eye, I don't know, but it did. And I ended up, walking over to it, and they kept saying to me, "Well, there's nothing there, there's nothing there." And I said, "Yes, there is. I can see it. I'm looking at it." And until I walked right up to it and actually touched it, nobody could see this. And it turned out to be one of the most interesting pictographs that I've ever seen in my life. And, it was almost like it was veiled in some form until, I'm not saying it was the right person, but somebody that would have been in sync with it in some form or fashion could see it, and it revealed itself. And I was told that nobody had ever seen that there before. Otherwise, they probably would have dragged it off the side of the mountain and put it in the courtyard where Frank Lloyd Wright's main compound was and is. So, I've always wondered about this, this life force in these symbols that are left, that do the remote viewers, do the psychic people, tap into it deliberately, or, do they harmonize with it on some frequency in some form or fashion? I don't know. But it's, it's very, very interesting.
Yeah, I've had similar experience when I was in Egypt, and a few years ago, there were some of the archaeological sites have actually been literally picked up and moved wholesale, because when they built the Anwar Dam, and they had to move several of the sites. And it's really weird because you can go to the site, and even though they've reconstructed it meticulously, it still feels just wrong. Like it's not in the right place. And it's just a subjective feeling, but it's something you just become aware of.
I think there definitely is. I think there's probably a combination of psychic impressions that are left that certain people can pick up, as well as possible you may get more hazy and sort of more out there things like the monks from the abbey telling the researcher where to find things. But I know I've been at a couple of experiences, one of which was at Avery, which is a big stone circle. It's actually, it's part of the Stonehenge complex, but it's actually further down the road. And because the village of Avery was built in the middle of this giant circle, they haven't been able to wall it off the way they have Stonehenge. So you can actually go in there and you can sit on or stand up against a standing stone and feel it. And this friend of mine had asked me to go do a protection meditation for her as yet unborn daughter. And I did this around sunset. We got there really late, and I'm leaning against the stone. And when I open my eyes, the sun is setting exactly at that moment, and not the one I'm leaning against, but the one next to me, there's an incredible face just emerges from the rock, and it had obviously been carved in there, but I think it had been carved to directly catch only the light at sunset, and it was the form of the face of a woman. And then as soon as the sun went down, she disappeared. And if you walked up to the rock, you could see very, very vague lines. I mean, the artist had obviously used some of the natural rock formation to make it happen, but it had been human manipulated. And other people may have seen this, I don't know, but it was like, I felt like something wanted me to see that. Because if you weren't there at exactly the right time, you would never have noticed it. So
well, I think there are a couple of things here, Neil. So you're getting into, I mean, there may be frequencies, right? Everything may be a frequency for that matter, just about. And so can we resonate with a frequency, right? So maybe it's in front of us the whole time and nobody can see it. Then things change and people start to see it, or just a few people start to see it. So that's kind of one possibility. But then there's also kind of a broader, I don't know what you want to say. There's kind of like the idea that something has an actual spirit itself, like a ghost or, an orb that's, I don't know, part of the spirit of somebody who's dead or something like that. I once went to a Native American burial area in the Southwest, and there were definitely different colored orbs there. Red and blue, I guess, and white. And it's quite an experience to see these. Now, I don't know if they're exactly the same as what people talk about as orbs, but I'm just saying I could see those. And those might not be a frequency as much as actually a residue of a soul, a spirit or something. So there can be different possibilities for that. And then, Neil, you're talking about some pictoglyph. There's the whole idea of a sigil, right? That energy is in something.
Oh, of course. Of course, I agree with that.
Now, I'm no expert in this, but others here might have a much better understanding of that. But certainly lots of people over the centuries have taken those very, very seriously. They think that it is quite important and that a type of graphic kind of image has deep, deep meaning and influences things. Neil, are you familiar with those?
I am, to a degree. I've never heard it called that way, but I do know, and it doesn't matter whether it was the Maya, the Aztec, or Native Americans, or the Vikings. When they recorded their history, the elders have said, that I know here, in North America, have said that every time they would tell a story, whether they were, pecking the stone or painting the stone, it was a prayerful thought because they wanted the story to last and last for as long as it needed to last. And in some cases, I think it's still very much alive. It's almost like we record tapes as we're recording, now. They recorded it in a different manner. And I really think that, a lot of anthropologists, archaeologists, as Disaster Cat is talking about, do pick up on this. And I think it has a huge effect on what they find. And I, do wonder about why governments and the powers that be and, military jump on sites and shut them down and things disappear. I think they're trying to read, the information on some level, which goes to the hidden archaeology. But yes, I do think that a lot of these places, whether it's a building or a pictograph, as I described, are very, very much alive, and we just haven't quite figured out how to tap into it, unless we're, as you say, inherently susceptible to reading those frequencies on some level.
I've never heard them with my own ears, but there are people who have reported, like standing next to the stones of Avery and hearing their hum, that they hum in different tones. Now, again, that's just what people told me, but I can sort of feel they feel very powerful, and they all feel different, and I can't describe in what way, but it just, to me, they seem almost like they're living things.
Well, of course, in a lot of traditions, there's a kind of a spectrum, that plants are alive, animals are alive, and minerals are alive, stones are alive. And maybe at a much slower, lower level or rate or whatever than humans, but one can imagine it's possible.
But I also think that stones that have, or inanimate objects that have been particularly intensely associated with, been worshipped by, or even just been handled by human beings, particularly over a very long period of time, do absorb some sort of energy. And again, my friend that went to Japan, that has a degree in Oriental Studies. Now, she's extremely gifted in the fact that she was an antique dealer for a long time, and she would used to able to pick up an object, and she could tell you everything about it, just all kinds of impressions off of it, and very often under circumstances when things could be, verified. And she said that it's just like, there are impressions that seem to stick to things, especially if they've been handled a lot.
Well, psychometry is just about, one of the oldest forms of psychic phenomena out there. It's well known that essentially something rubs off if it's been on a person a long time. A necklace or something like that can have a really strong kind of psychic energy with it.
And again, a lot of really good archaeologists seem to have a certain amount of this ability, but they're not allowed to talk about it. Or they have to cloak it in, I saw it in a dream, I obviously put it together, but really it's like they knew the minute they picked it up it was such and such.
Sure, exactly. Okay, well, how about we move to Neil? Is there any kind of mystery or anomaly or something that you're interested in?
Oh, many. Again, because
it can be mainstream. It's permitted. I mean, it's, slumming in the mainstream.
I think what I am interested in is this story that I just told you about, viewing this huge petroglyph, which is basically showing a comet coming into the Earth. It's long story short. It was part of history, and it really drove me to look at so many different places all over the world, wherever there were pictographs and whatnot, to have a look at these things, because I know somewhere there's a very deep hidden history. And then what's the name of the one in Turkey? Göbekli
Tepe?
That's the one. Thank you very much. That I find very, very fascinating. And that is mainstream, but they sure don't seem to talk about it a lot. And that is one in particular that I'm very interested in, how it could be so perfect and deliberately buried, and what happened and who did it, and what can we learn from it? Every one of them. So that's where I'm at.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting. Go ahead.
I think they're not talking about Göbekli Tepe because it just so screws with their heads. They've got this impeccable German archaeologist and the Germans, again, when I was studying archaeology, the Germans will just bore you to tears because they're just so meticulous in the way they train their people. But because of that, it's like really almost impossible for any other researcher to say, oh, this is just bunk, because the evidence is there. And it does their head in, because here you have right in the middle of nowhere, buried, which in itself was an amazing feat, these pillars with complete 90-degree angles and beautifully carved, and they probably at one time had roofs and all this stuff, and just amazing levels of sophistication that, quite frankly, I mean, I adore Stonehenge and Avery, but the level of work from what I've seen in the pictures of Göbekli Tepe, that the knowledge base seems to have been much larger, or at least what they were using it for. And yet, in the beginning, the archaeologists, they just kept saying, well, these were done by hunters and gatherers. And it's like, excuse me, unless, okay, if you're sort of resource farming in the sense that you're like the Kwajalein in the northwest of the U.S., where you can essentially build towns because you've got so many resources, you're basically farming, because you have the deer farming season and then you have the salmon farming season. Maybe they were like hunting and gathering that way, but you just don't get that kind of architectural sophistication without a lot of practice.
Yeah, I had a similar effect when I was in Egypt. I remember I was in one of the tombs and I saw these columns, and I thought they were modern. I thought they were like machined modern columns that they had put in. And the guy told me, he's like, no, those are the original. Those are 3,000 years old, and they look like they're absolutely perfect.
Well, Mash, now that's a good segue into the fact that archaeology and anthropology, maybe to some extent, don't like to look at other sciences, and bring them in. So what you saw there, tool engineers would look at it and say, oh, that was done with a modern tool. It's 0.001 millimeter or something like that in difference from one side to the other.
Right.
And that can't be done by hand unless some magic can do it, right? Maybe the ancient Egyptians had tremendous magical powers, but they couldn't do it by hand, rubbing, whatever supposedly they used, copper or something like that, which wouldn't work in the first place. So they don't want to get into the idea that technology was used. And really, what they don't want to get into is the devolution of man, right? It's only in modern times that we've returned to certain capabilities that we probably had whenever, 5 or 10 or 50,000 years ago. Some disasters wiped civilization out. I mean, there's a great deal of evidence for this. But throughout Egypt, for example, Mash, have you heard of Christopher Dunn? Do you know who he is?
I believe so. Yeah, look it up.
So he's like a British tool engineer who's lived in the U.S. for 30 years or so. Yes. And he's gone to Egypt and also South America, and he's written books like The Ancient Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt, I think is one of them. And they had very advanced tools that we only got recently, the last, 20 years or something like that. So that's a pretty amazing thing. And here you listen to Egyptologists talking about hundreds of thousands of slaves and on and on and on. And I look at it like, no, this was an amazing engineering performance. We should be in awe that they could build this. But they didn't do it by having, anyway, hundreds of thousands of slaves are not going to help you lift things that weigh 1,000 tons.
Yeah.
Because you couldn't put them in place. Have you been in the pyramids?
Yeah.
There are some places you're walking around there, and it's just like these are awkward sizes and whatever. There's no way. It doesn't matter how many people you have. You couldn't put them in place.
Yeah, you don't have enough room to work with.
Exactly. There's no way slaves with ropes could make any difference. They had amazing technology, and there you go.
And I remember reading I saw a guy, I can't remember his name, but he's like an amateur engineer, and he was trying to figure out like how they built Stonehenge, and him and another, just like maybe 20 or 30 other people, managed to put up like a replica of one of the Stonehenge blocks by just fulcrums and pivot points, and basically like literally walking the stone, end on end. And it's like he proved that you can do it by hand.
Yes, yes.
But I think people forget that I think they're a lot smarter than we give them credit for, our ancient ancestors.
That's what I'm arguing. I think we actually have had a devolution, and I think we're in kind of a psychic trauma, or have been for thousands of years from some disaster. And that's kind of a topic for a different show, perhaps. But the flood myths are all over Earth. I mean, something happened that caused some large percentage of people to die.
Yeah.
And a lot of that was from flooding. And then the aftermath would be that you couldn't farm, or, so on and so forth, right? And I don't know. I mean, recently we talked with Courtney Brown, and he has this project called the Atlantis Project. Mash, are you aware of that? Any thoughts on that?
I haven't read the sessions yet. I did the interview with him, but I haven't had a chance to read the sessions. Certainly can't say exactly. I would like to see how
I thought the sessions were pretty impressive, actually. I was a lot more satisfied with this than with the sessions from his climate change project. I thought these were almost all directly relevant to what the targets were. And, anyway, to me, it was much more like traditional remote viewing sessions should be. At least, as I define it, or what, I guess you can say I'm no expert, but I mean, it was according to protocol, so to speak. And the questions were not vague in the sense that, well, if this, then that, and then, it was just directly, here's a target number, what do you get? Right. And what they got was a civilization that created a worldwide disaster. And you were at the interview, so the basic part of it. And maybe that was it. Maybe that indeed was the disaster created by their military-industrial complex doing something stupid, which is entirely believable, right? If you look at what we're doing today, it's entirely believable that they'll mess up the air somehow or something.
I mean, you're going to look at like something like Fukushima and go, what were they thinking?
Well, yeah, and it's like, and they've been doing it 40 years. You get all these, you are using nuclear plants past their lifespan. You build them on the most earthquake and tsunami hit place on Earth, and you leave the fuel rods lying around, right, just sitting there. I mean, it really does seem crazy. And unfortunately, it's not unique. They're all over. The same design, the same stupidity. Now, that might be a particularly bad location. And they were using plutonium, and that's another topic, but they shouldn't be using plutonium in those things. But anyway, how about others? Disaster Cat, your thoughts? Was there, do you think, a more advanced civilization that got wiped out, maybe worldwide?
I think it's highly likely. I have kind of my major professor used to talk about how the Western mind is the only one that has a great difficulty believing two things at the same time in different realms. And he talked about his friend who was a Brahmin and a physicist who could explain all the reasons why the Ganges River was polluted and would kill you, but yet every day walked into the Ganges to cleanse it with his body because he was a holy Brahmin and this was his job. And when I was studying archaeology, I kind of just had to do that because I personally have memories and dreams and all kinds of things of what it seems to have been a technological civilization from way back. at least before the end of the last ice age. And I have had these memories and even drawn pictures as a little child and escaping on boats and things like this. And so it was all very, so I've got that on the one hand, and yet I also try to look at evidence. But I think there's a growing body of evidence that at the very least, you could make a really good argument for urban civilization being much older than was originally thought. And certainly it's pushed back already, in my mind, at least 12 to 15,000 years, which vindicates, I mean, there were things, and I'm no scholar on the Vedas, but I've heard from people that there's a river in the Vedas that's listed as in ancient India as running a certain way in a certain place, and that people were living on it, and it was all thought to be, you know, the Westerners just thought this was silly, this was garbage, until they got satellites and the space station, and there is the old riverbed, and archaeologists can see where there were settlements on it, and that's about 12,000 years ago, and that's about the same date back like Tepe. And since the sea levels have risen since then, and people tend to live on the coast, I think it's very likely that at the very least there was a coastal civilization that's now probably largely underwater that may or may not have been worldwide. But I certainly think that there was a lot more contact between people than modern scholars have given credit for. The fact that Europe kind of forgot about the New World for a while, I think was just a sort of a glitch of history. But I think there had always been some contact going on. But again, I think that there probably was, and it may have been even a little bit more sophisticated and a little bit farther ahead technologically than we are. And it wouldn't surprise me if it happened more than once. But there's a thing in archaeology, you tend not to find what you're not looking for. And I think this particular subject has been so taboo. I mean, even my major professor knew I was interested in it, and he would make me help him do slideshows on, you know, Atlantis, possibly Ethera and stuff, to try to almost like to burn it off. But it never completely went away because, again, I just have this gut feeling that we probably did. And I think there is a growing amount of evidence, especially for the off-coastal cultures, and even entire pieces of land like Sealand in the North Sea that existed and was inhabited. We don't know if they were inhabited by cities, but it was inhabited by people. That was between England and Scandinavia, and that's until fairly recent geological times. So I think there's a lot we've lost and a lot that would be very interesting. And I wish that there could be a more honest conversation about it. I wish that instead of using all the energy just to say, we know it couldn't be there, just start actually looking.
Well, what you're talking about is not just archaeology. It's everybody. It's in just about every field. People don't want to look for things that are inconvenient for their beliefs. You know, and that's kind of why we're in the mess we're in worldwide, I think. It's not just archaeology. But speaking of those, I mean, there's a book called Forbidden Archaeology by Michael Cremo. And then there's also different presentations by a guy named Klaus Dona. And there are other people, of course, looking into anomalies. I mean, it goes back at least to Eric von Däniken, for that matter. But he, of course, spun everything as being more like ETs, where I don't really think that that's needed. I mean, people have incredible capabilities. And I think we've really lost our minds, in a sense, for mainstream scientists to not, I don't know how to put this. They think that boats were too advanced for ancient people. I mean, when you read about the settling of the Americas or something, you get this idea that everybody had to walk on ice and through deserts, and it took them, you know, thousands of years to get down to South America and all this. And it's like, well, first of all, there are people today in the last 30, 40 years who just for the hell of it have decided to walk from the tip of South America, whatever, Tierra del Fuego, to northern Canada, and they can do it in whatever, you know, I don't know what the 2 years or something. Year and a half or something. And then there are people who just decide, I'm going to get in a small boat and go around the world. There are dozens and dozens of these people. The idea that somebody, go ahead.
Yeah, I got into trouble. I had a feeling I wasn't going to finish graduate school when we had a class on North American archaeology, and the first sentence in the book just about was people had to come over. They could only come over 12,000 years ago, or I think it was 48,000 years ago, because that's when there was a land bridge. And I said, why do they need a land bridge? They went, well, to walk over, of course. And I went, they don't need a land bridge now. They do it all the time in boats. And
Exactly.
I just kind of got glared at, Just, it wasn't an acceptable answer.
In other words, people 12,000 years ago didn't have the brains to build boats.
No, but they somehow got to Australia when they would have otherwise had to walk across the water. See, they finally, again, they grudgingly accepted that 50,000 years ago people could build boats because otherwise they couldn't have gotten there. But they really fought that tooth and nail, and there's still older people who don't accept the dating, that think there has to be something wrong with the dating.
Oh, this is so ridiculous. I mean, first of all, we got the Polynesians who could sail practically, and hit a small island from thousands of miles away,
Yep.
right? If they could do that 1,000 years ago or something, then the idea of coming along the coast, and besides that, what bothers me is, what would you do? I mean, if you take a boat, you've got a way to get out of Dodge quickly, and you got a way to get some food easily with nets, because back in those days, the oceans were just loaded with fish. When the settlers came to the United States, places like Chesapeake Bay, I mean, they didn't even have to use nets. They could just put pots in the water and grab fish. It was a much easier environment to catch fish back then. And so are you going to walk through deserts and ice and run into a tribe that's hostile to you, or are you going to take boats? I mean, it just seems so obvious that you would go by boat. And so I'm taking that as an example. Go from that, and then that's why they refuse to recognize advanced tools or other things that were used thousands of years ago. They don't even recognize the idea of boats. So of course they're not going to recognize the idea of some form of electricity or something like that.
Although I do have to say with the electricity thing, that engineering and board engineering and board archaeology students going back to the 1970s were sometimes looking at that rather famous, at least in kind of woo-woo circles, that picture of the Egyptian painting, where they're standing there and they've got this big tube-like thing with a couple of snakes in it, and it looks like a giant light bulb on a tripod. And people have built this over and over again. It's the same thing. Another one that board archaeology students have been known to do. In fact, I think even did this in the field, and was in the Nazca lines, where they have all that area where they have all the wonderful giant pictures of animals and beings that you can only see from the sky. And there's, they were like set out with rocks by the local people. And because it's a desert, it's still there a couple of thousand years later. There's also a whole lot of pottery, and this pottery, a lot of it is decorated with things that look like it could be balloons. And there have been a number of people, and again, quietly archaeology students bored, who have sat around and collected everything locally and made hot air balloons, and they fly just perfectly in the desert. Now, were they flying people? We don't know. Particularly the pottery doesn't seem to show people in it, but it's certainly not impossible that someone could have been going up there and looking down, even if it was just a priest or something. But again, you don't find what you're not looking for, or you're not supposed to find.
Well, I mean, if you lose your opportunity to get a doctorate or a grant or something, you're not going to do it. It's very simple.
Well, yeah, that's why I dropped out, because I just couldn't deal with it anymore. The electricity, now they know the Baghdad battery works. And during the Iraq War, this was a battery that was found from ancient Iraq. And it actually is a low-level battery. There was an engineering student that put 30 of these together, and during the war, when the electricity was bombed out, he was charging everybody's cell phones and little radios and things using 30 Baghdad batteries put together. And I think if he could figure that out, somebody else could have figured it out.
Yeah, but I think, though, I guess one problem I have here is that I think the archaeologists have been looking at our post-deluge collapsed societies, and they're not looking at necessarily when they were in their prime. And so let's say 2,000 years ago in Egypt, I don't think they had, massive electrical power plants.
No.
Right? Okay, I'm not arguing that. I'm saying that at some point, maybe 12,000 years ago, we don't know exactly, but at some point there was some disaster that was so grim that what we're seeing after that is just people trying to pick up the pieces. And over time, they did pick up the pieces. They did clean up, and the stray rocks or pieces of metal or whatever it is they had lying around, they started to use, or it otherwise got lost somehow. But we're kind of combining different periods, and this is one of the reasons, they say, where is the evidence? Well, first of all, stuff doesn't last. I mean, there's almost nothing that you use today that's going to be around in 10,000 years. I mean, almost rocks are the only thing. I mean, gold would last, but people are going to take it, right? So that's one issue. But anyway, I just think it's really a prejudice. The prejudice of modern man is that we're the best, progress, evolution, that kind of thing. And I think we need to look at that Michael Cremo's book, Forbidden Archaeology, which is like 1,000 pages or something. It's very big, 700 pages. And you can see there's evidence that not only 10,000 years ago, it's possible there were civilizations 1,000,000 years ago. Now, I'm not sure, but it's certainly possible. You find things in very awkward locations, and inside coal, for example, things like that. And you really have to wonder. So I don't know, but did any of you read what's his name, Schwaller-Lubitch's like Temples of Man? Any of his books?
No, I haven't read those.
Neil?
I can't say I remember the author, but I may have very well looked at the articles if I had recognized them.
Disaster Cat, you familiar with him?
I'd have to say the same thing. I might recognize it if you started talking about it, but I.
Okay, so he was from France, but he was kind of like an Alsatian, Germanically inclined guy. He was very much into esoteric stuff. Maybe some secret societies and things like that, not quite sure. But he lived in Egypt maybe 25 years or more, I don't know, studying and measuring all kinds of things. And it was mostly from a kind of occult or hidden perspective. But his books are classics. I forget the names of which temples represented what, but I mean, there's like a temple that everything about it illustrates aspects of the human body. The relationship of where the heart would be found, or that kind of thing, the length of the, legs versus the arms. I mean, it's like a tribute to the human body, or to, I mean, it's more than that, but that's an example. And some of the other ones, you see they're combinations of frequencies given off by the stones used, the different kinds of stones and the patterns. So it's very, very interesting. I recommend his stuff. I think you've probably seen it in the past. But they may have been different temples and different things may have been for purposes we can't even relate to today, like that. I mean, imagine building something complicated, and it's really just to illustrate how great it is to be alive, right? We can't relate to that. You build a place to make money, right? You hold a concert or a sporting event, right?
Well, it's also the hidden archaeology seems to dovetail with hidden history, and as you like to say, what are the reasons why? And I really, really think that it's part of our, could I say, global healing to, keep that link with the past, but particularly the hidden history which we can find through psychic archaeology and, things like that. And I think it's very, very important that it come to the forefront, because until it does, we're still a mess, collective mess. We don't know who we are or where we're going.
Well, we certainly don't know where we came from. They've been hiding it from us as best they can.
I agree.
You know, one thing I'm really interested in, are any of you familiar with the Bosnian pyramids?
I've heard of it.
Yes, yes, yes.
Well,
Yeah.
they're uh, they're finding, I mean, it's a huge complex. I think they're the biggest on Earth, bigger than the Great Pyramid. And they're finding stuff inside them that's been dated to 30,000 years ago. So this is most inconvenient for official science because whoever, I mean, those were tremendous achievements. So there was a civilization that could build those things 30,000 years ago and perhaps more. But they're also finding all kinds of interesting energy effects. Like, I mean, you can work inside them for, 10 hours and still feel fine. So they're incredibly energy giving. Neil, what do you know about them?
I can't remember the gentleman's name. I apologize for being poorly prepared here. But he's done a tremendous amount of work. And you're right, they are the largest in the world. And I do believe also that there have been anthropologists and archaeologists there to study some of the tunnels. And I can't prove it. I can only, tell you what, I've read and, seen on his site. And they are very, very much alive. And they, in some cases, 30,000 years is a conservative estimate about how old they are. And there's, I think, 3 or 4 that they've identified, and possibly another one. They're massive. They're just absolutely massive.
And of course, the EU is trying to make it so you can't dig or visit or do things because you see, they're part of the establishment and they don't want us knowing about these things. The good news, though, is that Bosnia is a small country. And essentially the whole country is very proud of these things. And they have massive digs every summer with volunteers. I'd like to go. Some interesting people go there, that write these strange books that we know and love. Anyway, the guy behind it, I can't do justice to his name. A name from that part of the world, Bogdanovich or something. I can't do justice to it. He has been a PhD kind of archaeologist with pyramid knowledge and studies in Egypt and all throughout the Americas. So he's hard for them to attack. Disaster Cat, are you familiar with have you seen any of his videos of pyramids around the world?
I think I saw one on YouTube. I recall looking at something on the Bosnian pyramids early on, and it sounds like it may have been the person that was narrating, but I hadn't paid a lot of attention. I do know. I'm
sorry. He argues they're all over Earth, not the size of the Bosnian pyramids.
Yeah, it was the same. It was the same guy. Yeah, I did see one video. He did.
I mean, the official establishment says, "Oh, they just put some rocks together," and it's like, I don't think so. I think that's a decayed, pyramid.
Michael Tellinger says there's pyramids all over Africa too. He agrees with that hypothesis, and so I wouldn't doubt that there are a lot more around than we know about.
Well, the thing about the Bosnian thing is, think about it for a second. This is truly an amazing discovery here. We're talking about things going back, as you said, conservatively 30,000 years. And they're in the league of the Great Pyramid.
But then around the same time period, I mean, a little bit, not the same location. I think it's in Czechoslovakia, but somewhere in Eastern Europe, they found people living. This was in between the ice ages. They found people living in settlements, burying their dead under the floor. They were weaving. It's 28,000 years ago. They could date the weaving from impressions, and they were making pottery. So there was obviously some fairly highly developed, at least village life, and possibly again urban life. We just don't know. But they certainly had at least living as well as the people building Stonehenge were.
Sure. what I'm trying to say, though, with this example, is this is something that if we were living in a better society or better era, would be, I mean, this archaeologist should be on the front page. He should be feted on famous TV shows.
Right.
Now he is in Bosnia, but he isn't in Germany or France or Canada, and I think that's tragic. This is unbelievably, this is a dark age we're living in, and I hope we come out of it soon, because that's ridiculous. We should have thousands and thousands of volunteers going over there, videotaping things, and it's just ridiculous, and yet almost nobody knows about it. I mean, if you walk down the streets of your local town and talked about this, how many people would have even heard of them?
Well, in that same respects, if you ask most Americans, if you tell them that Native American Indians had cities, they would look at you like you were crazy. Because our history books, you're taught that, everybody just lived in teepees and that's it. We don't even learn our own history that well.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's hard to learn from the other part of the world if you can't learn from your own. That's for sure.
Again, it just hasn't been convenient. I mean, one of the things we haven't finished it, but years ago, my husband and I started work on a novel based on the Vinland sagas, where this is what we have recorded from the Viking viewpoint of going to North America, and it's in the sagas that the Native Americans kind of beat them to a punch, and they left in certain areas. But one of the things we were going to have is, I said, this action is taking place the same time as Cahokia. I think the other thing that stops them is that they start talking to traders and things and find out there's this great big city with lots and lots and lots of people, and more importantly, what may even be a standing army, not all that far away, and maybe they don't want to go a whole lot further. There's speculation, but most Americans don't know there was a giant city at the same time that the Vikings were in North America. Just, not really close, but not that far away either in terms of trading and walking.
Yeah, and then there's another speculative angle. Are you familiar with the mystery of all the copper around the Great Lakes?
I've heard some, and I know that a little bit of it seems to probably be Viking, but a lot of it, and some of it is unworked copper, but some of it seems to be a lot older, and it's a lot harder to explain.
This goes back to, it ties into the giants of North America, the red-haired giants that we were just talking about here a little while ago. I was wondering the fellow's name, Jim Berea, who did a tremendous amount of work about that. And yes, there are a number of copper mines that, were used for thousands and thousands and thousands of years.
Well, I think the issue is that around the Great Lakes, you had some of the best copper on Earth. I mean, you had, incredibly large copper pieces, 100 pounds, 1,000 pounds, more than that, 10,000 pounds, whatever. And they had, they were polluted with a small amount of silver. But you could just grab them if you could carry the damn things. And it looks like starting, 3,500 years ago or something, if you accept the dating, somebody started mining and taking these things. And you start to ask, okay, well, where did they go? And I would think the big question is, did they get taken to Europe and North Africa and the Middle East or Near East for their development of industry and wars, the Bronze Age and all that? I don't know, but we have these mysteries of the sea peoples, right? And
Yes.
and the legends are that some people went over to the Great Lakes like every summer, took what they could and brought it back. Maybe they stopped in Ireland and Britain on the way, and then it went down to the Mediterranean area. Maybe it was a Greek Phoenician kind of civilization that did it. I mean, we don't really know. But it is one of the amazing mysteries on Earth that we really don't know. But somebody did it in a massive scale. The amount of mining was not something that could be explained, and the Indians didn't use very much copper. And their legends don't have it that they did it, that foreigners, came from far away and did it.
That's what I was going to ask. Was there any? What did the native people themselves say? Did they have any traditions concerning?
Well, we do have like when the Jesuits, like French Jesuits or something, first, the area I guess was first kind of explored by the French, and they were just told that the Indians, or at least in that area, were not interested in copper. It had no value to them. It was some, group of people coming from far away who came in the summers, and they just took it and left. And they did a minimal amount of trading with those people, maybe skins or, boots or things like that. But they just kind of kept to themselves. And then they went back. I don't know if they were giants or, red-haired, or I really don't know. But it is the time of the Sea Peoples, I believe. In other words, a Phoenician trading civilization could easily have been part of it. But it might have been a multi-ethnic thing. We have multi-ethnic networks in places like Southeast Asia, looking back in history. And so it doesn't have to be one country or one language or, one racial group. Business is business, as they say.
My joke about Phoenicians has always been, don't go across the Atlantic. There's the dragon there. We know. Yes, the dragon is, don't interrupt our shipping lines.
Yes, the dragon is in business.
Yeah, the dragon is, and I think this segues into a mystery that I think could so easily be solved and just isn't. And it's a perfect example, again, of this stupidity of the way the archaeological superstructure, for lack of a better term, is set up, the funding. Because, a few years ago, when it was all over the news and in documentaries, there was a lady who accidentally found, doing some research, cocaine and tobacco in a couple of Egyptian mummies that were in Europe. Now, there's only two ways those things got there, especially the cocaine, because there is no coca in anything related to coca in North Africa. One, 19th century beginning, proto-archaeologists were using their cocaine and smoking their pipes while they were working with the mummies. Perfectly plausible. Not very sexy, but we need to know that. Science needs to know that, so you can take that into account in the future if that's the case. Or the Phoenicians were somebody was taking their dragons over, bringing back some really high-quality trade goods like tobacco and cocaine, and of course the pharaoh and the royal family would get first dibs on it. Either way, it's very easy to solve with some testing. And yet the issue just kind of died, and there was nothing heard about it. And I finally did some inquiring around and heard that several people said that they were told that if they pursued this, they would never work in archaeology again. Didn't matter what they found. So it's like the question can't even be asked. And it's like, why? Because it may simply turn out to be the more mundane explanation of the research, the early researcher just not knowing to be very careful, or my goodness, now we have actual proof that there were trade routes. We don't know what they were necessarily. We don't know who was doing them, but obviously they were there. And either way, that's just such an amazing thing, especially that second option. But they're not, it'll destroy their career to even look. So this is probably going to go on for another generation. I may not even be alive when somebody finally gets permission to look at this.
Are you familiar with the quote from Niels Bohr that scientific progress occurs one death at a time?
Yeah, and that really is true in archaeology. I mean, we've talked about in other, I don't know on this show, but we've talked about the whole Clovis only thing where in North American archaeology, Neil, you may be familiar with that, where they claimed for about 30, 40 years there that people came to the New World, they only were here like for the last, I think it was 11,000 years. They kept pushing it back a little bit because they kept finding things that it was 12,000. But they were just absolute, and any find that contradicted that was just destroyed. I mean, not literally, but they would just, you couldn't publish about it. You couldn't talk about it. It was the end of your career. And then as the guys started dying off that had made their whole careers over that, suddenly they started finding all this evidence that, of course, people had been here long.
Well, the Viking settlements in Newfoundland and Labrador, I believe, when they were first discovered, it was the same thing. They said it's not possible, even though Boatic, who were there at the time, confirmed that they were there. They fought with them. And so, yeah, you're right, one death at a time.
Well,
Hey,
what proved it for the Vikings actually was my favorite, the drop spindle, because the women had come with them, and the women had Norse drop spindles, at least in Laos Meadows. But until they found that drop spindle, they were still, the Ingstads were being told, "Oh, you just found a Native American settlement."
Yes.
Yep.
Hey, I got one for you. Have any of you heard of the Kingdom of Juba?
I've heard of it, but I don't remember what it is.
Mash?
Nope, never heard of that one.
Neil?
I plead ignorance here, sir.
Well, that's fine. We all need to learn. This is okay. In the Roman period, the Roman Empire, there was a very prosperous trading, multi-ethnic country, small country called Juba in North Africa. And it was allied with the Romans. It was friends with them. And it had, again, it was multi-ethnic. It had different languages, different currencies, whatever. And Rome became decadent, evil, militaristic, the whole story, right? And eventually, people at the top of the Roman Empire decided, they got the bright idea that they should steal everything from all their friends. And so they decided to try to gin up a war against this country and steal all their money, because they were a very, very rich place, So it would be, Monaco or Switzerland in today's terms or something. And so this is really tragic and evil, of course. But it happens in history, and we may be watching it right now with the American Empire kind of on the rampage. Anyway, so the Roman army wanted to go steal all the money there and sell off as slaves all the victims, that kind of thing. And the country, again, a small country, realized that they were on the chopping block. And they got out of Dodge. They took all their money and their people, and they got in boats and they left. And we don't know where they went. So this is a case of a massive evacuation of money and people. And I don't know, but in the South, like MASH, in places like Tennessee, there are a lot of areas in the Mid-South, some in Illinois, different places in the middle of the country there, where you, over the years, have found a lot of stuff that's kind of North African from that period of time, the Roman Empire time. And you even have names, all kinds of the names in that part of the world are named things like Memphis. And you could do more justice to that probably than I could.
Well, actually, I live literally a few miles from an archaeological site it's nicknamed the Old Stone Fort.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't actually a fortress, but it was like a large earthen ring.
Mm-hmm.
It's I don't remember exactly how old it is. I mean, it almost dates back to prehistoric times. But that may be one of the things one of the places you may be talking about.
Well, of course, we don't know. I mean, even if they did go there, they would have, created their own civilization and mixed in over time, right? So after 1,000 years, they would have just been part of the mosaic of North America. I mean, that would be kind of the natural state of things. But anyway, it's entirely possible that this country, this small country, took the sea routes and just wherever it would take them, let's say Florida perhaps, and then whenever from, wherever it worked for them. I mean, it's a historical mystery and we can't prove it, but I'm just saying it is well known that a lot of things have been found over the centuries in the Mid-South, I guess you would say, that are very Roman, Phoenician, North African, whatever, from, let's say, that period of time, 1,800 years ago, 2,000 years ago, something like that. And it's always laughed at. Somebody put it there, right? Some kid is out playing, fishing, or something like that, and he, digs a hole and he finds some coins. And it's like, oh, well, somebody put it there, right? That's the explanation. But I'm going to say that doesn't really wash so much for me because typically when these things happen, the kids or the families or whatever, there's no way they would have had access or the spare money for such an unusual item. I mean, in those days, you would have had to have gone to a museum in, Boston or something, New York or something, Philadelphia. Some poor family in Tennessee was not going to be doing that. And they wouldn't even know what the things were. I mean, they wouldn't know the language. They would have no idea. So I find it kind of more likely that they actually were there. The question is what time, what people brought them. And that we don't know. But Disaster Cat, were you familiar with this a little bit now?
Yeah, it sounds familiar. I was also distracted in the chat room and unfortunately didn't hear everything you said. But I do have a question though, because one of my fascinations is with essentially pre-Columbian contact, and has been for years. But there's just a couple of glitches I think to throw a monkey wrench in here about a lot of contact, and the two glitches would be the extreme susceptibility of diseases that the North American and South American populations had to European diseases, at least of the late Middle Ages, early Renaissance. And the other is a little funnier. The other is house cats. Because the Phoenicians especially, and a lot of the early European sea peoples and North Africans, they took their ship's cats with them everywhere. And the fact that we don't find populations of domestic cats, say, on the eastern seaboard of the U.S. or now in Brazil or something, it's possible that they just not have made it, or that the big cats would have eaten the little cats. But I have to wonder about those two things, especially the disease resistance. Now, my husband, again, has suggested he's got a PhD in Old Norse studies from Cambridge, UK. So this is why we talk about this stuff at the dinner table frequently. It's just normal conversation around here. And he's pointed out there could have been a certain amount of what they call island effect, which is what protected the Greenlanders for so long from the Black Plague. They did eventually catch it, but they were like several years beyond the rest of Europe. And then they seem to not have gotten all the diseases that Europeans had, which could have been because it was primarily Greenlanders that made it to Canada and probably the North American East Coast. They may not have had, say, measles or mumps to bring with them the way mainland Europeans would have. Although there's at least one person from Norway who's recorded as being in the voyages, so that may or may not hold up. But again, I think that the whole Jared Diamond guns, germs, and war thing needs to be looked at, because I think there probably was contact, but how much was there? And again, there's also, when Neil would know more about this than me, there's always ask the people who were there. Ask for tribal memories, because it's like they remember the Vikings and the Vikings remember them. The sagas call them the Skraelings. They remember them quite well because they beat them.
Oh, sure, but let's say some group of people came in 2,000 years ago, and let's, for the sake of the argument, say they came into what's the area now near Atlanta,
right?
Okay, and then after 300-400 years, they started to be outgunned or whatever, and so they decided we got to get out of here, we got to move, and they move over closer to Tennessee.
Right.
From the perspective of the people in Tennessee who say, hey, this new tribe came in here, they're from the east, right? They don't say these people came from Africa.
Right.
From their point of view, they came from Atlanta. If they even know where Atlanta is, they're just going to say it's the east or the southeast. So I'm just trying to say, I think we can, we do have to accept the idea that there wasn't advanced technology back then, communications, things like that. And so, after a few hundred years, you are what you are, your family may have come to North America only 200 years ago, right? That's not that long ago. But yet, as a practical matter, you're from America or Canada. And So I'm just trying to say that if they were in some location 500 years and then they moved someplace 500 years and then moved again 500 years, they were Americans. Is what
Yes,
I'm
but
trying to say.
initially they should have brought their diseases with them, and of course they may have. We don't know for sure, but we do know that with the recorded European contact after the Vikings, the one where the Europeans really came and never left again. They were so toxic to the local population that there's one guy from one of the first conquistador expeditions. I don't remember his real name, but my husband and I always refer to him as Typhoid Jose, because he gets lost from the rest of the expedition. And he goes native. He does what anybody would do that's a good, decent person, or at least a reasonable, decent person. He basically became a trader on the Mississippi, and he went up and down the Mississippi and had a life there until he heard that there were some people to the south of his tribe, of his people, that were there. And then he goes back to Mexico and meets up with the rest of them and writes his memoirs, which is how we know about this guy. Where the second wave of people came through, they found all these abandoned villages that were completely empty and just no human life for miles around. And of course the Europeans, there's a famous quote, God depopulated the area for us so that we could take it and hold it as our own, or something horrible like that. But it was obvious that this poor man, who himself was not ill, had just probably destroyed nearly everybody. And if he's recorded, there may have been 3 or 4 or 5 other people that also got lost and wound up going native and had the same thing. But I mean, it's just, they think that there might have been as much as a 90% die-off of people. Think of that. 9 out of every 10 people that was in America dying from these diseases. And I just have to wonder, I don't know what the epidemiological level would be that you'd have to get of contact to where you'd have enough exposure that wouldn't happen. But again, that, to me, that just, I think that there's going to be a way found around that, or maybe they will find evidences of people dying off in epidemics that we don't know about, because particularly because, understandably, a lot of tribes do not want their dead disturbed. It's a very important thing with them, so we may just never know. But unless we find that kind of evidence, we won't know.
It is documented when Lewis and Clark went across their journey across the states that there were villages that they returned to on the way back that were darn near empty. And, from whether it was typhoid or smallpox or that kind of thing. So, yeah. But I've heard the population of the Native American people being as high as 80 million people before contact.
And that's mainstream. That's mainstream numbers.
Yeah, like I said, there are cities found in Ohio that were, held millions of people, pre Middle Ages, and now but then by the time the Europeans arrived, they were just gone.
See, that's Cahokia. That's what we were going to have in the Viking book, the novel that it still may or may not ever get written. But that was the heyday. Was like the 900, 1000 period. That was when they were very, very strong. But the cities were built of wood, so therefore, when the people left, they didn't leave these massive ruins behind that Europeans could immediately see and recognize as something.
Well, Disaster Cat, who knows? Maybe Cahokia was these people from Africa. I mean, we just don't know. I guess the issue I'm having here is, let's say that the disease that the Europeans brought, for the sake of the argument, let's say they brought all kinds of nasty diseases that the Native Americans couldn't handle. Then that basically happened around when? 1600 or so? 1700? Because it
was in the 14 and 1500s.
Was it that
primarily.
Early?
Yep.
I was under the impression that
Sorry, I think I'd have to look it up, but the guy I think was from the DeSoto expedition and that first die-off, and I believe it was before 1500. I'm in a medieval group that we stop at 1600, and you can get away with all kinds of things between 15 and 1600 going on in the New World, because it's going on already.
I was under the impression that with DeSoto, that's when we got the information that they have these civilizations and settlements, and then it's later when it comes time to develop the area, settle, and so on and so forth, that they'd been wiped out.
Oh, yes. Yeah, he records it being there, and then there's also this guy, I think it's from his expedition, that winds up going native for 2 or 3 years there and then rejoins back with the Spanish, and then it's when it's when the next group of people come through that everybody's dead.
In any case, though, I don't see that the Europeans in, let's say, 1600 are necessarily related to North Africans of the year 0. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is, let's say at that time a tribe came from Mexico City or the Yucatan. I mean, for all we know, there might have been diseases. I mean, we just can't know, is what I'm trying to say. I don't think we know what the situation would have been. The argument with the cats, that's kind of interesting. I'm not sure if this particular civilization, the Juba one, really did have, that. Certainly the Egyptians did, but I don't know how effective that was at the daily level for the average person. You like cats. Can you tell us, did the average person in Egypt have cats?
Probably.
Or was that a thing for the royalty?
I've actually written an unpublished book on some of this, so stop me if I go on too long.
Uh-oh.
But cats, cats seem to have been a really important part of the European farming program. And we know this because when the first settlers went to Malta 9,000 years ago, the first settlers that were agriculturalists, they brought their pigs and they brought their goats and their seeds and their other animals. You can see all this. And they brought their cats. And one of them is actually buried with a woman 9,000 years ago, and her burial is her pet cat. And the reason cats are part of the European farming package and were worshipped in Egypt was because they provide rodent control. I've actually talked to my native elder friend about this, and I asked him if, who kept down the rats in Cahokia? I mean, obviously you have urban centers and you don't, I said, were they keeping bobcats or something? And he said, no. He said, but we finally concluded that at least in South and Central America, it may have been small dogs. I don't know about the North American cities. I don't think anybody does, because it's not a question. People are so removed these days, unless you live someplace like agricultural rural Ireland or parts of the U.S. where there's still a lot of farming, just how important cats are. And on ships, particularly the Phoenicians and the Egyptians and some of the others, not so much the Egyptians, but the Phoenicians in particular, their cats were so important. Their ship's cats that kept down to vermin that would otherwise destroy the food and even gnaw through the ropes and possibly even sink the ship. The cats were so important. They were to be saved in a shipwreck, sometimes before the sailors. They were given, the Egyptians were very closeted about their cats. They were, in terms of gifts, they would be like from royalty and stuff because they were semi-divine or divine creatures. But most people had them because they were kind of everywhere. They lived in the granaries and they're native to the area. And even modern domestic house cats are part of, mostly some of them are part Egyptian cat. But the Phoenicians were not that way at all. And that's why if they were just going to Brazil or something, I could see how the cats might not have made it. But if they were sort of going all over the place, it would be really surprising if the cats, because the cats run off ships, they make other cats, they populate local areas. And we're pretty sure it was the Phoenicians or related sea peoples that brought cats to Rome, to Northern Europe, and possibly even like the Tin Islands, like England. Ireland got cats really, really late. That's another interesting thing. Ireland was very isolated and may not have had domestic cats until basically until a little after Roman times. But so anyway, that's where I came up with the cat theory, and it's just, I've never heard it from anybody else, but I've just wondered, and I just found out recently, to sum up here, that in Peru, little cats that are native to the area are sacred to the farmers. And they're sacred because they keep the rats and mice down. So even though they're not domesticated, they're playing that same role. And who knows if the Europeans hadn't come, if within another 500, 1,000 years, if there would have been domesticated cats, at least among the Inca and the Inca, Moche, Peruvian, Ecuadorian areas. I don't know. But they do play a very important role. So yeah, cats were everywhere.
Well, I don't know what to say to that. I'll just say that, there's the question of, 2,000 years is a long time, or 1,500 years or whatever. And so if indeed these people from Juba did come across, and if they went to the U.S. area instead of, let's say, Central America or the Caribbean or whatever, um, I don't know. Maybe, maybe the cats didn't make it. I don't know.
Well,
But
if
things
it
do
was the
change, though.
Juban
I mean,
people,
look at the dogs. Today in Islamic culture, dogs are really not so good. They have a very bad image, and I think I think it's a religious thing, actually. I think it's part of Islamic culture. Sorry, go ahead.
oh, just that I'm to edit out. Sorry, don't remember what I was going to say.
Oh, well, no problem. I'm just saying cultures change. I mean, Turkey in the last 5,000 years has probably been 5 different cultures, right? I mean, things change.
Yeah,
So
but
we just can't.
even with the Islamic dogs, though, dogs are still tolerated because they're necessary for survival in many areas. And now I'm not saying with one particular group, like I wasn't thinking of the Juba people, I was thinking of the Phoenicians because cats were so important to them, and
Mhm.
their ship's cats are known to have sort of populated at least a lot of the European world. But yeah, no, you're perfectly correct. I mean, if one group of people in an exodus, their cats might not have made it. They might not have brought them with them. They might not have survived a sea voyage. I mean, that would make perfect sense.
Yeah, well, we just can't know. Don't I? It's all speculation at this point. I'm just trying to say there are all these mysteries, and we don't really know. But I tell you what, let's wrap it up soon, and let's close with kind of a last thought. Any ideas on what you think might be coming in the future? Do you think there's any interesting research, either psychic in nature or otherwise? Mash, any thoughts?
I don't know of any psychic research that's being done, especially mainstream colleges or anything. They won't even touch it with a 10-foot pole. I mean, the only interesting thing that's popped up recently is Courtney Brown's Atlantis project. And I kind of wish somebody would do something similar, but, take a known archaeological incidents, like, talking about the red-haired mummies that were found in China, and do a session on that and try to find out more information.
Well, what you're saying is we just need more and more because we have so little in
Right.
terms of psychic work. I mean, for sure, it's disappointing. I think we have less now than we did 20 or 30 years ago when
Yeah.
Stephen Schwartz was doing his stuff. And that's really sad because it wouldn't take that much money. But there you go. Neil, any thoughts?
Well, I think there's a lot of research going on, but it's all being done by the powers that be. Um, you
Yes.
can you can go to earthfiles.com, Linda Moulton Howell, for instance, speaking of pyramids, and there's a huge project up there in Alaska about one that is hidden under a mountain of all places. Um, there's been so many stories, I've heard firsthand accounts, of government officials showing up, particularly in this country, in North America, to historical places and shutting it down, and then everything disappears. Um, Again, I think, to get a clear picture of our future, we really need to know our past, and finding out about the hidden history, the hidden archaeology, is certainly, in my opinion, a key to the future. That's about all I've got to say.
Well, I agree with you on that. I've heard rumors of massive digging and expeditions and things in Antarctica. I'm not sure how true it is, but I think
I'm sure it is true.
there's a
Sure it
lot
is.
going on there, or let's just put it that way. There was stuff there at one point in the distant past. Disaster Cat, any final thoughts?
Yeah, just that I'm really watching and have a lot of interest both in the a growing field of underwater archaeology, because I'm hoping that eventually at some point they're going to come up with something that they have to look at. That just with particularly with satellites and some of the new technology, it's becoming, well, the whole Courtney Brown thing with their Atlantis project, that came out of, I guess, Google Earth initially. I think, the powers that be sort of try to shut things down when they realize that they've done something like that, but a lot of times it's kind of shutting the barn door after the horses escaped. And the other thing that I'm really excited about is some of the genetic breakdowns that they can do that are really showing and supporting all sorts of legends. And it may eventually, they could, if looked at the mystery that you point out in Japan, or the ancient European DNA being found in some East Coast areas of North America among traditional peoples, things like that. I think those are the two really places that a lot of breaking ground is being made, and I'm looking forward to continuing to follow that.
Well, speaking of technology, I mean, almost the sky's the limit if they would just use it. I think it's they just don't want to use it, because obviously the DNA would show stuff that would be kind of earth-shattering. But then with all this tomography or whatever, ground penetrating radar or ocean imaging, you could imagine that there's, there must be cities on the bottom of the ocean all over the place. Now, some of them aren't that deep, but nonetheless, that's going to be quite exciting. And I actually wonder how they're going to deal with the fact that soon small groups will be able to afford to do some of this. Essentially treasure hunters, but I mean, looking at more interesting historical anomalies instead of sunken treasure ships. Well, I don't know that there's anything to really say in terms of, moving forward. It just depends on how it plays out. But I do think academia will have to change a little bit with the rise of technology. As you said, it'll just be too obvious. Everybody's going to say, why don't we use this DNA? And they are using it a little bit, right?
Yes.
Aren't they testing, certain areas, certain things? So, it's going to spread.
Ireland, the Irish turn out to be primarily Basque. And of course, the old Irish legends were that the original settler, well, the major wave of settlers came from Spain, and it was all the academics always said, "Oh, that isn't true. That's just a myth," but actually, they did.
I hadn't heard that. That's interesting.
Oh, it was all over the papers here. You can imagine it was a bombshell, because everybody that thought they were Celts, well, culturally they're Celts, but physically they're actually most closely related to the Basques, particularly the older population.
That raises the question then of what the Celts were versus the Basques. In other words, I mean, you look at the Irish and they look, a lot of them have red hair and, that kind of thing. And
is that where the idea of the Black Irish come from?
It's hard to tell. What they came up with the genetic testing was, so far there was a early population, which again fits the legend without getting into too much detail. And it's nearly 4 a.m. here, so my brain is fried.
Time to give.
but basically. There was this very, very indigenous farming population, of hunting and gathering population, which is kind of unknown, but they can trace them. And a lot of the women are descended from them, but then there seem to have been farmers that came over that seem to have replaced a lot of the male lines from the original hunters and gatherers. So there's that group of people, and then there's also a huge number of people that seem to have come in from the Basque, very, very fairly ancient times, but they came in from the Basque area, just like the legends say that there was this indigenous population, and then the Celts, or in this case, with the people from Spain came over in boats, and they fought in the legends. They fight the people who are already here, and they win and they take the land. And that's we don't know about the fighting part, but genetically, the most of the Irish, they're actually Celtic. And when you say who are the Celts, that's probably another whole show, but probably they were cultural. It was a cultural transfusion rather than a physical one. Because a lot of the red hair and stuff is Viking.
Yes. But then again, maybe they were Neanderthals. Another topic.
That does. As someone who has what my professor called a perfect Neanderthal skull, I can say that I do have family from that area of Germany, and my guess is that probably you had a higher proportion of Neanderthal DNA from the closer you get to that part of Northern Europe. But who knows? Could be right.
Yeah, we don't know. Okay, well, anyway, thanks everybody for coming. Let's wrap it up, and till next time.
Great.
Take care. Thanks.
Take care.
Thank you.
Night.
Have a good
Good night.